Welcome to Work This Way, a labor and employment podcast. I'm Tina Emerson, here today with labor and employment attorney Christy Rogers. Good to see you.
Hey, Tina.
Well, we have somebody else in the Maynard Nexsen family with us today. Joining us is David Dubberly to talk about the new personnel at employment-related agencies under the second Trump administration. David is certified by the South Carolina Supreme Court as a specialist in employment and labor law and is trusted by his clients to help them navigate compliance matters, defense of government investigations, and litigation. We're happy to have you here.
Thank you, Tina.
Glad to have you. A lot has changed inside these federal agencies since Trump took office earlier this year. Let's get started by talking about the new leadership at the Department of Labor. What are they focused on now, and how is that different from the Biden administration?
Okay. Thank you, Tina. We have a new Secretary of Labor. She was confirmed and sworn in 2 weeks ago. Her name is Lori Chavez de Remer. Good Hispanic name. We both speak Spanish.
I love it. I love it. I'll roll my R's on that later.
There you go. She had bipartisan support in the Senate, and this is unusual for a Republican Secretary of Labor. She had support from the Teamsters. And the reason for that was when she was in Congress, she not only voted for, but she also co-sponsored the PRO Act, which was a very kind of pro-union piece of legislation. The PRO and the PRO Act stands for Protecting the Right to Organize. So it would have made it easier for unions to win representation elections. Fortunately, that law didn't make it all the way through Congress, but that is a part of Secretary de Remer's background. She is in the process of filling out her leadership team, and one kind of notable member of that team is going to be David Keeling. He will be the Assistant Secretary of Labor for OSHA. He is highly regarded all around. He spent 40 years at UPS. He started out at UPS as a package handler, made his way all the way up to the top of, as far as being the global head of safety and health for UPS. He did that for 40 years, and then he went to Amazon for a few years. He was their global head of safety and health. As far as what the new administration is focused on, they're focused on reversing a lot of initiatives of the former administration, as you might expect. The former administration had basically 5 priorities under the DOL. They came out with a new joint employer rule, a new independent contractor rule, a new overtime pay rule, which is what we were all talking about a year ago, would have fairly drastically raised the minimum salary requirement for the main exemptions from the overtime pay requirement. And in the OSHA area, they came out with the walk-around rule, which was the most controversial of all their initiatives. It would have allowed union organizers to participate in OSHA inspections even at non-union facilities. And then the 5th one was the least controversial of all of them, was the heat safety rule. Now, the new administration will definitely bury the walk-around rule. On the other rules, they will revisit them and come out with new versions of them that are easier for employers to comply with. Especially the overtime pay requirement, they're likely to go back to the drawing board and increase it some, just not as drastically as the prior administration wanted to increase it. On the heat safety rule, everybody recognizes the need to protect employees from heat outside and inside environments. But the heat safety rule of the prior administration was so detailed, it would have made it difficult. It hasn't made it out of the rulemaking process yet. It got almost to the end, but that one will be revisited and made a little bit easier for employers, but still providing protection for employees from heat. So that mainly covers what's going on at the DOL.
So, David, let's talk about the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. That's a big one for employers, as we know, and there's been some shakeups there with regard to leadership and maybe, initiatives and kind of where we see the EEOC kind of moving under the Trump administration. What are your thoughts on that?
So at the EEOC, we have a new acting chair. Her name is Andrea Lucas. She's a former lawyer, worked at the Gibson Dunn firm in Washington, a very highly respected firm. She has been on the commission for 4 or 5 years. Well, it has to be less than 5 years because that's how long the appointments last. She's been there about 4.5 years. Just earlier this week, President Trump renominated her for a second term, so she's going to be there for a while. One of the controversial things that President Trump did regarding the EEOC is that soon after the inauguration, he fired 2 of the commissioners, 2 of the Biden appointees to the commission. So right now we've got Andrea Lucas, there's another commissioner, then there was a vacancy, and then there was the 2 that was who were fired. So we don't have a quorum at the EEOC, which means they can't come out with new guidance and they can't start like major lawsuits that they would all have to agree, that they would have, a majority would have to agree on. But daily operations continue. As you very well know, employees continue to file charges. The EEOC continues to investigate them. As far as their priorities, the priorities of the new administration are 100, even more so than in the DOL area, 180-degree opposite. The Biden administration had 2 main priorities for the EEOC. Number 1 was sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination and harassment. They put a ton of emphasis on that, came out with some very detailed guidance that was ostensibly based on the Bostock versus Clayton County, Georgia case out of the U.S. Supreme Court in 2000, which said that Title VII protects sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination. But they, I guess the new administration would say that they overinterpreted that decision. So that was their number 1 priority. Their number 2 priority was DEI initiatives, promoting DEI initiatives. The new administration believes that the emphasis on sexual orientation and gender identity is bad for women who are supposed to be protected by the EEOC. And we don't have time to get into the reasons for that, but it has to do with single-sex bathrooms. And the new administration takes a very dim view of DEI. They believe that really it promotes, or at least in some cases, promotes reverse discrimination. So once the EEOC is up to a quorum, once the commission has a quorum, you're going to see new guidance on both of those areas taking a very different approach than the prior administration. There's one new area of emphasis in the new administration. They believe that a lot of people who are supposed to be protected by Title VII are not being protected because of the emphasis on other things. And this is like religious accommodation. You know that during COVID, we saw a lot of people wanting a religious accommodation to not have to get vaccinated. The new EEOC will be a lot more sensitive to those kinds of claims. They're also big on anti-religious harassment, specifically anti-Semitism. The EEOC will take a much bolder approach in investigating claims of religious harassment. And also, this sounds a little crazy, but they believe there's a lot of anti-American discrimination in the workplace, that people are being not hired or not promoted because they're American versus some other kind of national origin. So they want to put more emphasis on those kind of claims. I mentioned the Bostock case on sexual orientation and gender identity. Another big case out of the Supreme Court in the last few years that involved discrimination was the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard. And that case held that the Equal Protection Clause does not allow affirmative action in college admissions. The new EEOC is going to be accused by the other side of overreading that decision, because that kind of forms the basis for some of their antipathy toward DEI initiatives.
And the National Labor Relations Board, they have a lot of changes too. Can you share what's going on there and how that will impact businesses?
You're right. The NLRB is huge in our area. We have a new chair of the NLRB. He's new to the well, he's not even new to the chair position because he was chair for a few months several years ago. He's been on the commission for 7 or 8 years. Within a few days of the inauguration, President Trump appointed him as the new chair. We have a new general counsel of the NLRB, which is a very important position. That was just announced 2 days ago by President Trump. The nominee, because she has to be confirmed by the Senate, is named Crystal Carey. She is a lawyer with Morgan Lewis and other very highly respected law firms. She's in their New York office. And she will be the new general counsel once she is confirmed. The acting general counsel that President Trump named soon after the inauguration has already been busy rescinding a lot of the general counsel memos from the prior administration. The prior administration was super controversial in the NLRB area. They had general counsel memos that basically said non-competes are illegal, at least with employees before management. They tried to extend employee rights to student athletes. Both of those initiatives have been rescinded. They also came out, the board itself, the general counsel prosecutes cases, the board decides cases. The board decided a bunch of cases in the last 4 years that made it easier for employees to win complaints, lawsuits based on unfair labor practice charges. They also came out with decisions that made it harder for companies to win union election campaigns. Those are decisions by the board that can't just be wiped out by a new NLRB chairman. New cases are going to have to come to the board. But eventually, over the next 4 years, employers expect that the more controversial decisions will be reversed.
So, David, you talked a little bit earlier about how, Trump comes into power and, of course, he makes, wastes no time kind of cleaning house and dismissing some people. But I know there's been some controversy around some of these dismissals that he's enacted with respect to folks at these agencies. And I know some of our listeners may have heard about the Wilcox versus Trump case. But if they haven't, will you tell us a little bit about that case, kind of, and where it is, what the status is, what those allegations were in that case?
It's a fascinating case. It has real world implications for employers, but it's also people who are kind of nerdy about the Constitution. There's a lot for them to kind of dig into there. I mentioned a few minutes ago that President Trump, right after he was sworn in, fired 2 EEOC members. Well, the EEOC commission is set up by Title VII, and it's basically says commissioners are appointed by the president for 5-year terms. You can only have 3 from one party, and supposedly 2 are from the other party. But commissioners under Title VII do not have job protection. There's not for-cause termination under Title VII. What's interesting about the NLRB is it says also the president appoints, and under the NLRB, once the president appoints you and you get confirmed by the Senate, you can only be terminated for malfeasance in office or like gross neglect, and then only after notice and an opportunity to be heard. So President Trump fired member Gwen Wilcox, soon after he was sworn in. And in so many words, his team said, we don't have to give a reason. We know the NLRA says you can only fire a board member for gross misconduct, malfeasance, and you've got to give them notice in a hearing. But we think that provision in the NLRA, written by Congress in 1935, nobody has ever in the last 90 years tried to fire a board member. The president's team says that law is unconstitutional because it interferes with the president's ability to run the executive branch. And that's a very interesting question. So Member Wilcox filed a lawsuit after she was fired. She filed an expedited motion for summary judgment, which was granted about 3 weeks ago by Judge Howell of the District of Columbia District Court. And she won. And Judge Howell has a interesting decision going all through the constitutional issues because President Trump's team admits that there is no cause to fire Member Wilcox. It's just what the president wants to do. The administration appealed Judge Howell's decision to the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeal for the District of Columbia a week ago. They had a hearing about a week ago. And one of the three members of that panel is Judge Henderson from South Carolina. And we're going to wait and see what they decide. But I can tell you, whatever the District of Columbia Circuit, the D.C. Circuit decides, that is not going to be the last word. This case is going to the U.S. Supreme Court, and it's going to be fascinating to see all these separation of powers issues play out.
What articles of the Constitution are we talking about here? You mentioned that it's the first time a president has ever fired somebody at the NLRB in what, 90 years, you said? In the 90 years of its existence?
Since 1935, yes.
Right.
Ma'am.
So what articles of the Constitution are in play here?
Well, we have to go back to elementary school for a minute.
Let's do it.
Article 1 sets up the legislative branch, Congress. Article 2 is the executive branch headed by the president. Article 3 is the courts, the judiciary. And right now what we have is Congress wrote a law, says you can't fire a board member except for cause. The president said that interferes with my duties as the executive, and it will be up to the third branch of government, the courts, to decide, is the NLRA, when they provide for for-cause termination only, is that constitutional? Does it violate the separation of powers? And there are think tanks in Washington on both sides of the issue. You read the paper of one and you think, well, that makes a lot of sense. You read the paper of the other one and you say, that makes a lot of sense. It's going to be an interesting issue for the Supreme Court to decide.
One of many that they will probably have to
Many,
decide
yes.
with all the changes going on.
Well, there are lots of changes to be sure, and I hope by the time that this airs or someone's listening or watching it that it hasn't changed yet again. But if you are seeing this, it means it hasn't changed yet, so we'll just have to have David back for another one. Thank you so much for being with us today and running through all the changes. There are aplenty, so we will wait for the next round. Thanks, Christy, for being here.
Thanks, Tina.
And thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Work This Way.